She possessed the most angelic, comforting voice of the 20th century. As the lead singer of the Carpenters, her velvet contralto defined an era of wholesome, flawless American perfection to the world. She was the ultimate girl next door, living a life of multi-platinum records, Grammy Awards, and absolute sunshine. But behind the dazzling smile and the immaculate melodies lies a reality that completely shatters the wholesome illusion. Karen Carpenter was a prisoner trapped inside a golden cage built by her own family. A generational talent who desperately craved the approval of a cold matriarch who only had eyes for her brother. A young woman who had absolutely no control over her career, her finances, or her own future. Driven by a suffocating psychological agony, she engaged in a terrifying, silent rebellion to regain control of her own existence. She slowly, tragically faded away in front of a global audience. How does the most comforting voice on earth endure a life of absolute emotional starvation? What is the agonizing cost of maintaining the illusion of the perfect family? And why did this gentle soul have to literally disappear to finally be heard? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the tragedy of an icon, you must first know the invisible tomboy hiding behind the drums. The golden sun, the matriarch, and the fortress of drums. There's a profound, beautifully manicured illusion surrounding the concept of the mid-20th century American dream. We are conditioned to look back at the 1950s and 1960s through a lens of absolute, flawless nostalgia. We picture quiet suburban neighborhoods, pristine green lawns, spotless kitchens, and families that gather around the dinner table in perfect harmony. But behind the locked doors of those immaculate suburban houses, a completely different, heavily suppressed psychological reality often existed. In a household where absolute perfection is demanded, love is rarely given freely. Love becomes a currency. It becomes a highly conditional reward, carefully rationed out only to those who obey the rules and fulfill the expectations of the architect. When Karen Carpenter was born on March 2, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut, she did not arrive as the center of her family's universe. The throne of the Carpenter household was already permanently, undeniably occupied. Her parents, Harold and Agnes Carpenter, were deeply conservative, hard-working people. Harold was a mild-mannered, quiet man who largely faded into background. The absolute, undisputed dictator of the home was Agnes. She was a fiercely strict, uncompromising matriarch who ruled her family with an iron will and a devastatingly cold emotional detachment. And Agnes had already chosen her masterpiece. For years before Karen was born, Agnes had given birth to a son, Richard. Richard was a musical prodigy, a boy capable of playing complex classical pieces on the piano before his feet could even touch the pedals. In the eyes of his mother, Richard was not just a child. He was the golden ticket. He was the undisputed genius who was destined to bring unimaginable glory, wealth, and prestige to the Carpenter family name. From the very first moment Karen could comprehend the world around her, she understood the brutal, silent hierarchy of her own existence. Richard was the sun, and she was merely a small, orbiting planet, entirely dependent on his gravitational pull just to be noticed by their mother. For the older audiences watching this, especially the women who grew up in an era where sons were frequently elevated to the status of royalty while daughters were treated as secondary citizens, quietly expected to stay out of the way, Karen's profound, aching childhood wound is incredibly, painfully recognized. Emotional starvation begins long before physical starvation ever takes hold. Imagine the sheer, invisible agony of being a little girl, desperately yearning for the warmth of her mother's embrace, only to be constantly shushed because her older brother was practicing the piano in the parlor. The house was filled with the beautiful, soaring melodies of Richard's music. But for Karen, those notes were a constant, deafening reminder of her own inadequacy. She believed, with the quiet, devastating certainty of a neglected child, that she was fundamentally unremarkable. In 1963, when Karen was 13 years old, the entire family was abruptly uprooted. Agnes decided to move the Carpenters from the freezing winters of Connecticut across the country to Downey, California. The move was not made for the health of the family, and it was certainly not made for Karen. It was a massive, calculated geographical gamble executed for one single, explicit purpose: to place Richard closer to the Hollywood music industry so his genius could finally be discovered. Karen, pulled away from her friends and the only home she had ever known, was simply treated as excess baggage. In the sun-drenched, image-obsessed culture of 1960s Southern California, the awkward, slightly chubby teenager felt more isolated than ever. Agnes wanted a delicate, feminine, and perfectly poised daughter who fit the traditional mold. But Karen was a tomboy. She loved playing baseball with the neighborhood boys. She was rough around the edges, fiercely competitive, and desperately trying to find a way to take up space in a world that constantly demanded she shrink. And then, during her years at Downey High School, a miracle occurred. To avoid running track in physical education class, Karen joined the school marching band. She was initially assigned a glockenspiel, an instrument she absolutely despised. But as she stood in the band room, surrounded by brass and woodwinds, her eyes locked onto something else. She saw the drums. She begged her parents for a drum kit, and eventually they relented, purchasing a set of Ludwig drums. The moment Karen sat behind that snare drum and picked up the heavy wooden sticks, a magnificent psychological alchemy took place. She didn't just learn how to play. She mastered the instrument with ferocious, breathtaking, natural rhythm that astonished her teachers. But to understand the true, monumental significance of the drums, we must look far beyond the music. We must look at the psychology of a deeply bruised, invisible girl. "I'm a drummer who sings," Karen would famously insist throughout her entire life, clinging desperately to that specific identity. Why did she love the drum so much? Because a drum kit is not just an instrument. It is a physical, impenetrable barricade. When Karen sat behind the towering cymbals, the massive kick drum, and the gleaming toms, she was building a fortress. The drums physically shielded her body from the judgmental, critical stares of the world. She didn't have to worry about looking pretty. She didn't have to worry about being perfectly poised. She didn't have to worry if her mother thought she was too chubby. Behind the drums, she was completely, absolutely safe. Furthermore, the drums allowed her to do the one thing she had never been allowed to do in the quiet, oppressive atmosphere of her mother's house. She was finally allowed to be loud. When she smashed the cymbals and pounded the snare, she was screaming into the universe, demanding to be heard. The rhythm was her rebellion. The beat was her heartbeat, amplified and undeniable. Agnes, naturally, despised the drums. She thought it was profoundly unladylike and entirely inappropriate for a proper young woman. She constantly criticized Karen's choice. But the drums survived Agnes's disapproval for one incredibly tragic, deeply ironic reason. Richard liked her drumming. Richard, the golden child, realized that his sister was actually a brilliant metronomic percussionist. He needed a drummer for his jazz trio, and Karen fit the bill perfectly. Because Richard demanded it, Agnes tolerated it. The ultimate, crushing tragedy of Karen's passion was that her only source of joy was allowed to exist purely because it served the ambitions of her brother's genius. In the late 1960s, the Richard Carpenter trio began performing around Los Angeles. Karen was perfectly, blissfully content. She was safely hidden in the back of the stage, buried behind her beloved Ludwig drums, keeping the beat while her brother commanded the spotlight. But destiny, operating with a terrifying, unpredictable cruelty, was quietly preparing to dismantle her fortress. During one of their recording sessions, a producer suggested that the drummer try singing a lead vocal. Karen stepped out from behind the drums, walked up to the microphone, and opened her mouth. The sound that emerged was not the voice of a teenager. It was a rich, three-dimensional, incredibly sorrowful, and unbelievably intimate velvet contralto. It was a voice that sounded like a warm embrace on a freezing winter night. The producers in the recording booth were absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable perfection of her tone. The record executives looked at the golden son, Richard, and then they looked at the invisible sister, Karen. And in that precise moment, the gravitational pull of the entire Carpenter universe violently shifted. The executives realized that Richard was a brilliant arranger, but Karen, the tomboy who just wanted to hide behind her cymbals, was a true, undisputed star. The golden cage was being prepared. The industry and her own ambitious family were about to violently drag her out from behind the safety of her drum kit, forcing her to the very front of the stage. The girl who was terrified of being looked at was about to be completely, mercilessly exposed to the glaring, white-hot spotlight of global fame, setting the stage for a psychological collapse that would ultimately end in the most quiet, devastating tragedy in the history of American music. The melody of the world, the frozen spirit, and the illusion of love. There is a devastating, almost industrialized cruelty in the way the entertainment industry consumes the spark of a gentle soul. We are conditioned to believe that when a performer steps under the light and is greeted by the thunderous roar of a global audience, they are being offered the highest, most fulfilling nourishment a human being can ever taste. But the roar of an arena cannot heal the starvation of the home. In the summer of 1970, the universe handed the siblings a masterstroke of destiny. The Carpenters released their rendition of They Long to Be, Close to You. It was not merely a radio hit. It was a cultural earthquake. It soared immediately to the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100, wrapping the entire planet in its warm, immaculate, and deeply comforting melody. Overnight, Karen and Richard were catapulted from a local jazz trio into global superstardom. For the older audiences watching this, those who remember where they were sitting in their living rooms, turning up the volume on their console radios when the sweet, velvet contralto of Karen floated through the airwaves, her voice was the ultimate soundtrack of peace. It was a musical miracle. It made you believe that beauty, kindness, and flawless harmony still existed in a world increasingly torn by social upheaval and unrest. But as the applause grew louder, the girl standing at the epicenter of the hurricane was experiencing a profound, suffocating dislocation. The machinery of the music industry, combined with the unyielding ambition of her family, aggressively demanded that Karen become a permanent fixture in the blinding spotlight. She was no longer a drummer who happened to sing. She was the front woman. She was the face. She was the product. This transformation was an absolute psychological violation of who she actually was. Karen was a shy, deeply introverted young woman who found her joy in the rhythmic, invisible solidarity of the band. She was terrified of the spotlight. She agonized over her appearance, deeply convinced that she did not possess the glamorous, statuesque beauty that the global press demanded of a pop icon. Reflecting on this devastating, internalized friction, the agonizing disconnect between the girl she saw in the mirror and the flawless idol the world demanded her to be, Karen once offered a quote of such startling, melancholy honesty that it cuts directly to the bone. "I have a hard time dealing with the sudden fame," Karen confessed softly to a close friend, her voice carrying the weariness of a girl who had been entirely swept away by a tidal wave. "I just want to be me. But the Carpenters is a machine, and I have to be the fuel that keeps it running, even when I'm empty." The machine? I have to be the fuel, even when I'm empty. Listen to the breathtaking, quiet sorrow of that metaphor. She was the most comforting voice on earth, yet she was entirely unable to comfort herself. She was surrounded by millions who professed to love her, yet she walked through her days feeling incredibly, agonizingly invisible. The early 1970s became a dizzying, suffocating marathon of success. The Carpenters were touring relentlessly, performing hundreds of live shows a year across the globe. They recorded smash hit after smash hit. "We've only just begun," "Top of the World," "Yesterday Once More." They were invited to the White House. They were on every major television special. Yet, in this glittering ascent, Karen was systematically, methodically stripped of her autonomy. Her life was no longer her own. Every second of her day was meticulously scheduled by her mother, Agnes, and her brother, Richard. Richard served as a producer, the arranger and creative mastermind, deciding exactly which songs she would sing, exactly how she would interpret the lyrics, and exactly what image she would project to the world. Agnes, still entirely obsessed with Richard's genius, acted as the fierce, unyielding gatekeeper of the family's business empire, routinely critiquing Karen's weight, her fashion, and her decisions while showering endless, doting praise upon the golden sun. Drained of all creative and personal agency, Karen found herself living a life where she could not even decide what to eat for dinner, what dress to wear to a photo shoot, or how to spend the vast sums of money she was earning. She was an adult woman, a multimillionaire, a global icon, yet she was treated within her own family as a malleable, compliant child. This wasn't a malicious conspiracy. It was a devastating, blind tragedy. Her family truly believed they were protecting her. They believed they were merely managing a flawless, multi-million-dollar brand. But in their obsessive quest to maintain the pristine, wholesome perfection of the Carpenters, they entirely failed to see that the human being they were managing was quietly, agonizingly fading away. When you are an adult and you realize that you have absolutely no control over the direction of your own existence, your mind will desperately, instinctively search for a territory where you can establish absolute, totalitarian control. For Karen, that territory became her own body. As the mid-1970s approached, she began to exercise with frantic, punishing obsession, and most tragically, she began to micromanage, control, and eventually aggressively restrict every single calorie she allowed herself to consume. To the outside world, it looked like extreme discipline, an idol staying incredibly fit to look beautiful on television. But it was not about beauty. It was not about vanity. It was a desperate neurological and psychological cry for agency. It was the only wall she could build to separate herself from the suffocating demands of the world. By controlling her food, she was screaming, in the only language she felt she could speak, "This is mine. This, at least, belongs to me." It was a silent, agonizing rebellion against the machinery of her family and her fame. Her body became the absolute battleground of her existence. As the years wore on, the weight began to fall away. Her cheekbones became sharper. Her dresses hung loosely on her frame. And yet, the only thing her mother and brother saw, the only thing the industry saw, was that Karen looked more photogenic on the television screen. The sickness of her soul was literally being celebrated as a physical triumph by the very people who loved her. She was starving to death in plain sight, trapped in a room filled with the adoring love of the entire planet, yet entirely devoid of the singular, warm, unconditional embrace she had been begging for since the freezing winters of her Connecticut childhood. She felt as though she was a character in a play written by other people, reciting lines that belonged to someone else. The more the world fell in love with her, the less she felt that she had any right to be here. The applause was a thunderous, rolling ocean of approval, but was an ocean that carried absolutely no buoyancy. It was pulling her deeper and deeper and deeper into a suffocating, dark trench. And as 1976 drew to a close, the triumphant, bright-eyed girl was entirely gone. In her place sat an exhausted, fragile woman who was harboring a secret, desperate loneliness, entirely unaware that the most agonizing, heart-wrenching traps of her existence were still waiting for her, a trap disguised as a dream to break free, and a trap disguised as a fairy tale romance that was about to break her heart beyond all human repair. The solar rebellion, the severed wings, and the empty vow. There's a brief, breathtakingly beautiful moment in the life of every captive bird when the cage door is accidentally left open. For a fraction of a second, the bird looks out at the vast, terrifying, and magnificent sky, and it has to make a choice. It can stay inside the safe, predictable confines of the cage, or it can risk everything, spread its atrophied wings, and leap into the unknown. By 1979, the perfectly calibrated, multi-million-dollar machinery of the Carpenters had violently ground to a halt. Richard Carpenter, the golden son and the absolute creative dictator of the duo, had developed a severe, debilitating addiction to quaaludes. The pressure of constantly churning out hit records had completely broken his system. He was forced to cancel their upcoming tours and enter a rehabilitation facility to save his own life. For the first time since she was a teenager hiding behind a drum kit in California, Karen Carpenter was completely, unequivocally alone. There were no recording schedules. There was no brother to arrange her vocals. There was no mother hovering over the soundboard. The cage door was open, and Karen decided to fly. She packed her bags, left the suffocating, hyper-controlled environment of her family's compound in California, and flew to New York City. She partnered with a legendary producer named Phil Ramone to record her very first solo album. To understand the sheer, exhilarating psychological liberation of this specific project, you must look at what Karen was actually trying to achieve. She was 29 years old. She was a woman, but the world and her family still treated her like a perpetual, sexless teenager. She wanted to prove to the universe, and more importantly to her mother, Agnes, that she was not just Richard's little sister. She was an artist. She had her own voice, her own desires, and her own adult identity. In the studios of New York, Karen recorded tracks that completely defied the wholesome, sanitized Carpenters brand. The music was slightly edgy, influenced by disco and R&B. The lyrics were mature. For the first time in her life, Karen was laughing in the studio. She was making her own creative decisions. She was spending her own money. She was eating, socializing, and breathing the electric, independent air of Manhattan. It was a magnificent, desperate rebellion of the soul. In early 1980, holding the master tapes of her solo album like a fragile, precious newborn child, Karen flew back to California. She was incredibly proud of what she had created. She gathered her parents, Richard, and the top executives from A&M Records in a listening room. She pressed play, waiting for the applause, waiting for the validation, waiting for her family to finally, genuinely look at her and say, "We are so proud of the woman you have become." But the applause never came. Instead, a heavy, agonizing, and absolutely lethal silence filled the room. Richard listened to the tracks and was reportedly furious. He hated the new sound. He hated the mature direction. He felt that the album completely betrayed the established Carpenters brand. Agnes, siding entirely with her golden son, offered Karen absolutely no support or comfort. The executives at A&M Records, terrified of alienating their core demographic, sided with Richard. They collectively looked at Karen's heart, her independence, and her soul, and they essentially threw it all into the garbage. They demanded that the album be permanently shelved. It would not be released. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated psychological annihilation of that exact moment. When the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally look at your purest, most authentic self and tell you that it is unacceptable, the rejection does not just break your heart, it permanently fractures your foundational sense of worth. Karen did not scream. She did not fight them. The lifelong habit of being compliant, people-pleasing girl completely overpowered her brief rebellion. She nodded, accepted their verdict, and watched them lock her beautiful, mature voice away in a vault. She was devastated. A close friend later recalled, describing the absolute, invisible death of Karen's spirit that day. That album was her declaration of independence. When they rejected it, they rejected her. It confirmed her deepest, darkest fear, that she was only valuable to them if she was standing next to Richard, singing the songs he told her to sing. They rejected her. It confirmed her deepest fear. Listen to the terrifying, suffocating cruelty of that realization. For the audiences watching this, especially the men and women who have spent their entire lives twisting themselves into knots, suppressing their own dreams, and sacrificing their own happiness just to earn the approval of a parent who will never, ever be satisfied. Karen's defeat is a moment of profound, tear-inducing empathy. The wings were completely, ruthlessly severed. The cage door was permanently locked, and her severe, life-threatening battle with anorexia nervosa which had been quietly simmering in the background, aggressively accelerated into a 5-alarm medical crisis. She was starving. She was drowning in plain sight. And in an act of absolute blinded desperation to escape the suffocating grip of her mother's house, Karen made a catastrophic, impulsive decision that would ultimately seal her tragic fate. In 1980, at 30 years old, Karen met a man named Thomas Burris. Burris was an incredibly handsome, seemingly successful, and aggressively charming real estate developer. He swept Karen off her feet, offering her the exact illusion she had been desperately praying for, a knight in shining armor who would carry her away from her family and give her the one thing she wanted more than music, more than fame, and more than her mother's approval. Karen Carpenter desperately, fiercely wanted to be a mother. She wanted a house filled with children. She wanted to build a family where love was given freely, not conditionally. Burris promised her the world. He promised her a family. But Thomas Burris was not a knight. He was a master manipulator, a cruel opportunist who saw the fragile, wealthy, and emotionally starved superstar as the ultimate prize. Just days before their lavish, highly publicized wedding ceremony at the Beverly Hills Hotel, Burris casually delivered a piece of information that was so unimaginably cruel, so fundamentally evil, that it defies human comprehension. He casually informed Karen that he had undergone a vasectomy years prior. He was physically incapable of having children, and he had absolutely no intention of ever having it reversed. Stop and consider the sheer, paralyzing horror of that moment. Karen was 30 years old. The wedding invitations had been sent. The media was watching. Her family was watching. The man she was about to marry had just casually admitted that he had lied to her about the only thing she actually cared about. He was completely, permanently stripping away her dream of motherhood. Karen was absolutely hysterical. She called her family, weeping, begging them to help her cancel the wedding. But the crushing, suffocating weight of appearances, the absolute paramount importance of maintaining the perfect image, once again overpowered her reality. Her mother, Agnes, reportedly told Karen that the wedding had already been paid for. The guests were arriving, and canceling would be an unacceptable public embarrassment. So, on August 31st, 1980, Karen Carpenter put on a beautiful, flowing white wedding dress. She walked down the aisle, clutching a bouquet of flowers, and she married a man she knew was a liar. She smiled for the cameras. She posed for the photographs. She played the role of the perfect, glowing bride. But beneath the heavy layers of white silk and lace, the girl from Connecticut was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. The marriage was an absolute, unmitigated disaster from the very first day. Burris was reportedly verbally abusive, excessively controlling, and aggressively spent Karen's hard-earned money to fund his lavish lifestyle. He mocked her painfully thin appearance. He referred to her affectionately as a bag of bones. He completely isolated her, taking the broken, starving girl and pushing her head entirely underwater. She had tried to fly, and her family had shot her down. She had tried to run, and she had run directly into the arms of a monster. As the agonizing, dark months of her marriage dragged on, Karen Carpenter's physical body began to systematically, terrifyingly shut down. The most beloved voice in American music was rapidly approaching a silence so profound and so permanent that the entire world would soon be forced to confront the absolute, devastating cost of their own applause. The false dawn, the withered heart, and the closet of illusions. There's a profound, terrifying misunderstanding regarding the nature of physical starvation. Society often looks at a wasting body and assumes it is a result of vanity, a superficial obsession with mirrors and magazine covers. But for a woman trapped inside an impenetrable, highly engineered psychological prison, starvation has absolutely nothing to do with beauty. It is a silent, desperate declaration of war. By 1981, the magnificent velvety voice that comforted the entire globe was emanating from a physical vessel that was systematically, rapidly shutting down. Karen Carpenter's disastrous, incredibly toxic marriage to Thomas Burris had acted as a final, catastrophic catalyst. Trapped in a union with a cruel manipulator who had deceitfully stripped away her lifelong dream of becoming a mother, and still entirely tethered to the overwhelming, suffocating demands of the Carpenters' musical machine, Karen's eating disorder mutated from a secret coping mechanism into a 5-alarm biological emergency. Her weight plummeted to an astonishing, terrifying 80 pounds. The girl who used to play the drums with fierce, athletic joy was now so incredibly fragile that she had to lie down and rest between vocal takes in a recording studio. But inside this fading, skeletal frame, a magnificent, entirely unexpected spark of absolute defiance was quietly beginning to ignite. For the very first time in her 31 years of existence, Karen Carpenter decided that she actually wanted to fight back. She realized that if she remained in Los Angeles, surrounded by the suffocating expectations of her mother, Agnes, and the cruel verbal abuse of her husband, she was going to die. In a staggering act of breathtaking courage, Karen filed for divorce. She fired the husband who had called her a bag of bones, packing her bags and fleeing across the country to New York City in 1982 to undergo intensive, immersive psychological therapy. She was finally, desperately trying to save her own life. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who grew up in the rigidly conservative decades of the 1960s and 1970s, an era where mental health was considered a shameful, unspeakable taboo, and families went to agonizing lengths to sweep their private miseries under the rug, Karen's decision to seek professional help was a monumental, heroic rebellion. She was admitting that the perfect American family was a lie. She was admitting that she was broken. In New York, isolated from the deafening noise of the Hollywood machinery, she fought a grueling, agonizing daily battle against the invisible monster in her mind. She forced herself to eat. She underwent intense counseling. To the outside world, and even to her family, it appeared that a miraculous, beautiful resurrection was taking place. Over the course of nearly a year in therapy, Karen gained approximately 30 pounds. The hollows of her cheeks began to fill out. The color returned to her skin. When she flew back to California to celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas with her family in late 1982, the media and the public breathed a massive, collective sigh of relief. The crisis seemed to be over. The beloved girl next door had successfully slain the dragon. "I have a lot of living to do," Karen cheerfully told a friend during this period of perceived recovery, her voice brimming with a newly discovered, fierce optimism. "I'm going to get my life back. I have a lot of living to do." Listen to the absolute, heartbreaking tragedy buried inside that sentence. She genuinely wanted to live. She had finally untangled herself from the toxic marriage. She was preparing to finalize her divorce. She was making plans to record new music, to travel, to finally exist as an independent, 32-year-old woman. The psychological prison doors had finally been kicked open. But destiny, operating with an incredibly cold, mathematically precise cruelty, does not grant pardons based on psychological breakthroughs. What the doctors, her family, and Karen herself did not fully comprehend was the devastating, irreversible physical toll that years of extreme starvation, combined with the secret, desperate use of over-the-counter thyroid medications and laxatives, had inflicted upon the most vital organ in her body. Her mind had finally healed. Her spirit was finally ready to soar. But her heart muscle had been stretched paper thin. The rapid weight gain in New York, rather than saving her, had placed an unbearable, catastrophic strain on a cardiovascular system that had been functioning on the absolute brink of failure for half a decade. The universe was preparing to deliver the most agonizing, poetic, and utterly devastating irony in the history of American music. The date was February 4th, 1983. It was supposed to be a day of magnificent liberation. On this specific Friday, Karen was scheduled to drive to her lawyer's office to sign the final, official papers that would legally terminate her disastrous marriage. It was the day she was going to officially reclaim her name, her fortune, and her absolute independence. She had spent the night at her parents' sprawling, meticulously decorated home in Downey, California. Early that morning, Karen woke up. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the coffee pot, and then walked upstairs to her mother's massive walk-in closet to select an outfit for the day. She stepped into the closet, surrounded by the beautiful, expensive garments of the family she had spent her entire life desperately trying to please. And in the absolute, deafening quiet of that California morning, the exhausted, battered, and immensely fragile heart of Karen Carpenter simply surrendered. There was no dramatic Hollywood explosion. There was no final, profound speech. The heart that had poured so much unconditional love, velvet warmth, and comforting resonance into the ears of hundreds of millions of strangers simply had absolutely nothing left to give. She collapsed onto the floor of the closet. When her mother, Agnes, discovered her unresponsive body moments later, the pristine, flawless illusion of the Carpenter family dynasty permanently shattered. The paramedics rushed to the house. They frantically initiated emergency procedures, loading the 32-year-old superstar into an ambulance, desperately fighting to restart her heart as they sped toward the hospital. But the damage was too absolute. The invisible thief had already crossed the threshold. Karen Carpenter was pronounced dead at 9:51 a.m. Stop and consider the sheer, staggering, and incredibly morbid literary poetry of the exact location where she drew her final breath. This was a woman who possessed a voice that had conquered the entire globe. She had traveled to Europe, to Japan, and to the White House. She had earned millions of dollars and acquired a level of fame that most human beings cannot even fathom. She had spent the last 2 years of her life fighting with every ounce of her strength to escape the suffocating, controlling, and emotionally barren environment of her mother's household. And yet, when the final curtain fell, she did not die in a glamorous penthouse in New York. She did not die on a grand stage in London. She died on the floor of her mother's closet. Despite all the wealth, all the platinum records, and all the desperate attempts to fly away, the little girl who only ever wanted to be loved was violently pulled back by the gravitational force of her childhood trauma. She died surrounded by the fabric of the very house that had built her golden cage. The news of her sudden, incomprehensible death completely paralyzed the world. The global public, which had spent the 1970s listening to her sing about love, hope, and rainy days, was violently forced to confront the dark, agonizing reality of mental illness and the lethal consequences of eating disorders. The girl next door was gone. The velvet voice was permanently silenced. But the tragic, completely unavoidable aftermath of her passing was about to expose the deepest, most uncomfortable truths about the American obsession with perfection, leaving a haunting legacy that would fundamentally alter how society views the silent, invisible battles fought behind the closed doors of our most perfect families. The funeral of illusions, the unyielding matriarch, and the echoes of denial. There is a terrifying, almost mechanical resilience to the human ego when it is confronted with catastrophic guilt. When a family has spent decades meticulously constructing an impenetrable, highly profitable public facade of absolute perfection, the sudden, violent intrusion of a devastating tragedy does not necessarily shatter the illusion. In many cases, it simply forces the architect of that illusion to build the walls even thicker. On the cold, quiet morning of February 8, 1983, the world gathered to mourn the loss of Karen Carpenter. The funeral was held at the Downey United Methodist Church in Southern California. The sanctuary was filled to absolute capacity, with over 1,000 mourners. The biggest, most powerful titans of the music industry, from Olivia Newton-John to Dionne Warwick, sat in the pews, wiping away tears. Millions of devastated fans gathered outside, standing in silent shock, struggling to comprehend how the wholesome, radiant girl who sang close to you had simply ceased to exist at 32 years old. But if you strip away the beautiful floral arrangements, the solemn hymns, and the immense global outpouring of grief, a profound, deeply disturbing psychological drama was quietly playing out in the front row of the church. Sitting rigidly in the pews were the two people who had completely controlled the narrative of Karen's entire existence: her brother, Richard, and her mother, Agnes. To understand the absolute, chilling tragedy of Karen's aftermath, you must understand how her family processed her death. The global media, finally waking up to the dark, lethal reality of anorexia nervosa, began to ask incredibly difficult, probing questions. Journalists and psychologists started to gently, respectfully inquire about the immense pressures placed upon the young superstar and the suffocating, demanding environment she had desperately tried to escape. But Agnes Carpenter, the fierce, uncompromising matriarch who had dictated every single move of the Carpenter dynasty, did not crumble under the weight of self-reflection. She did not publicly acknowledge the profound, psychological starvation that had driven her daughter into the abyss. Instead, Agnes doubled down on the illusion. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who grew up in the incredibly rigid, image-conscious era of the 1950s and 1960s, where admitting to any form of mental illness or familial dysfunction was considered an unforgivable, shameful failure, Agnes's reaction is a terrifying, universally recognized defense mechanism. She protected the brand. In the immediate years following Karen's passing, the official narrative heavily promoted by the family was that her death was a tragic, almost unpredictable medical anomaly. They emphasized the physical strain of her grueling touring schedule. They focused on her heart failure. They spoke lovingly of her talent. But they aggressively resisted any narrative that suggested Karen was a deeply unhappy, emotionally neglected prisoner of her own family's ambition. They just couldn't handle the truth, a close associate of the family later observed, detailing the agonizing, suffocating wall of denial that surrounded the Carpenter estate. Agnes was incapable of seeing Karen as a victim of her own parenting. To admit that Karen starved herself because she felt unloved would mean admitting that the perfect family was a lie, and Agnes was never, ever going to let that happen. Agnes was never, ever going to let that happen. Listen to the absolute, bone-chilling cruelty of that denial. A young woman had literally sacrificed her physical body, shrinking down to 80 pounds, silently screaming for independence and affection, and her mother responded to her death by ensuring that the public relations machinery continued to function without a single glitch. The profound, agonizing irony of Karen's death is that even in the grave, she could not escape the control of the people who had managed her life. Richard, carrying the immense, heavy burden of surviving his brilliant sister, poured his grief into the only outlet he knew, the recording studio. Over the ensuing decades, he took meticulous control of Karen's unreleased vocals. He remixed, rearranged, and released posthumous Carpenter albums, ensuring that the pristine, flawless sound of the duo remained perfectly intact for future generations. But even Richard's dedication carried a deeply melancholy, tragic undertone. In 1996, 13 years after Karen's death, Richard released a solo album titled Time. He dedicated the album to his late sister, singing a song called When Time Was All We Had. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking tribute from a brother who clearly missed the girl he used to make music within the garage. Yet, when you look closely at the history of those unreleased tracks, a devastating reality emerges. The incredible, mature solo album that Karen had recorded in New York in 1979, the edgy, disco-infused, highly personal record that she had been so intensely proud of, the very same album that Richard and Agnes had coldly rejected and permanently shelved, remained locked in a vault for over 13 years after her death. It wasn't until 1996 that Richard finally, reluctantly permitted a limited release of that solo project. Think about the staggering, almost unimaginable insult of that timeline. For 13 years, the only piece of music Karen Carpenter ever created entirely on her own terms, the only project where she felt like an independent, empowered adult woman, was deliberately kept hidden from the world by the very brothers she had spent her life supporting. They controlled her voice in life, and they meticulously curated her voice in death. When you examine the totality of the Carpenter family dynamic, you are not looking at villains in a cheap Hollywood melodrama. You are looking at a deeply tragic, Shakespearean failure of human empathy. Agnes did not want her daughter to die. Richard did not want his sister to suffer. They simply loved the idea of the Carpenters more than they understood the fragile, bleeding girl named Karen. They loved the applause. They loved the platinum records. They loved the millions of dollars that bought them sprawling estates in California. And in their desperate, blinding pursuit of maintaining that perfect, wealthy illusion, they completely forgot how to love the girl behind the drum kit. The most devastating consequence of Karen's passing was not just the loss of the greatest voice of her generation. It was a profound, permanent silence she left behind in the culture. Prior to 1983, eating disorders were largely considered a bizarre, incredibly rare, and deeply shameful taboo. People did not discuss them in polite society. But the shocking, highly publicized reality of Karen Carpenter's death violently ripped the polite curtain away from the ugly truth. The global public was forced to look directly at the terrifying monster of anorexia nervosa. They were forced to realize that an eating disorder is not a glamorous diet gone wrong. It is a lethal, psychological disease rooted in severe emotional trauma, a desperate need for control, and profound, unbearable feelings of inadequacy. Karen's tragedy single-handedly ignited a massive, global awareness campaign. Millions of dollars were poured into research. Countless lives were ultimately saved because young women and their families suddenly recognized the warning signs that the Carpenters had so tragically ignored. The girl next door died, but the profound, agonizing echo of her death shattered the silence for millions of invisible, suffering people around the world. But as the decades rolled on and the 20th century faded into the 21st, the beautiful, haunting velvet voice of Karen Carpenter refused to disappear. It remained permanently woven into the cultural DNA of the planet. As the world continues to listen to her sing about love, longing, and rainy days and Mondays, we are left with the ultimate, agonizing realization of her magnificent, tragic existence. The universe had given us an angel, but we were completely unprepared for the terrifying price of keeping her in a cage. The immortal echo, the empty drums, and the ultimate grace. There's profound, almost terrifying magic in the mechanics of recorded sound. When a human being steps up to a microphone and presses their absolute, unvarnished soul into a piece of vinyl, they are quietly defeating the laws of biology. The physical body is incredibly fragile. It can be starved. It can be broken. It can be fundamentally crushed by the suffocating weight of parental expectations. But a voice, if it is pure enough, and if it carries enough genuine, bleeding human emotion, becomes entirely indestructible. Today, in the spring of 2026, 43 years have passed since that freezing, devastating February morning when Karen Carpenter collapsed on the floor of her mother's closet. The physical world she inhabited has entirely moved on. The brutal, unforgiving pop culture landscape of the 1970s is now a distant, nostalgic memory. Her mother, Agnes, the fiercely uncompromising matriarch who built the Golden Cage, and her father, Harold, have long since passed away. Richard, the Golden Son, the brilliant arranger who meticulously crafted the Carpenter sound, is now an elderly man in his late 70s, standing as a sole, quiet guardian of his family's incredibly complicated legacy. The massive, heavily guarded house in Downey, California, the very same house where the music was made and where the tragedy reached its agonizing, permanent conclusion, was eventually sold, renovated, and altered. The physical prison no longer exists. But the girl who died inside that house, she never aged a single day. She is forever 32 years old. To look at the cultural landscape of 2026 is to witness an absolute, undeniable miracle of artistic immortality. You cannot walk through a shopping mall during the month of December without hearing her velvet, impossibly warm voice singing Merry Christmas, Darling. You cannot turn on a classic radio station on a rainy afternoon without hearing the melancholic, comforting perfection of Rainy Days and Mondays. For over 4 decades, the entire planet has continued to use her voice as a global emotional anesthetic. But for the older audiences watching this, for the men and women who actually lived through the 1970s, who bought the records and who now understand the dark, horrifying psychological reality that was hiding directly behind the album covers, Hearing Karen Carpenter's voice today is a profoundly different, immensely heartbreaking experience. When we listen to her sing Superstar, we no longer just hear a beautiful pop song about unrequited love. We hear a desperate, exhausted young woman begging the universe to see her. We hear a girl who was forced to stand at the very front of the stage, stripped of the protective armor of her drum kit, singing with absolute perfection while her physical body was literally fading away in front of a global audience. She poured every single ounce of the unconditional love she desperately wanted to receive from her mother directly into the microphone, offering it to millions of strangers instead. We loved her. The entire world loved her. But the agonizing, brutal tragedy of Karen Carpenter is that the applause of a billion strangers can never, ever fill the specific, aching void left by a parent who refuses to look at you and say, "You are enough, exactly as you are." Her death fundamentally, permanently shattered the great American illusion of the perfect family. In the 1960s and 1970s, society was aggressively conditioned to believe that if a family lived in a pristine suburban house, if the children were polite, and if the lawn was perfectly manicured, then the family was happy. Mental illness, eating disorders, and psychological abuse were considered shameful, filthy secrets that had to be swept tightly under the rug. Maintaining the facade of perfection was considered infinitely more important than saving a human life. Karen Carpenter was the ultimate, tragic casualty of that toxic, suffocating perfectionism. She did not die because she wanted to be thin. She died because she was a brilliant, fiercely independent tomboy who was methodically, brutally erased by her own family's ambition. She died because in a world where she had zero control over her money, her schedule, her song choices, and her adult independence, the only thing she could completely control was the size of her own body. Her invisible, silent rebellion cost her everything. But in her tragic, untimely passing, she ripped the polite, smiling mask off of American society. She forced the medical community, the media, and families across the globe to look directly at the horrifying reality of anorexia nervosa. Her sacrifice undeniably saved the lives of millions of young women who finally recognized the warning signs, and whose parents finally understood that keeping up appearances is never worth the price of a child's life. When we look back at the absolute totality of her brief, magnificent 32 years on Earth, the greatest tragedy is not just the music she never got to make. The greatest tragedy is that the world rarely remembers her as the brilliant, elite musician she actually was. We must never forget that before she was a pop star, before she was a tragic icon, Karen Carpenter was a drummer. She was a fierce, metronomic, incredibly talented percussionist. She possessed a natural, unteachable rhythm. If you look at the rare, early footage of Karen sitting behind her massive Ludwig drum kit, her eyes are not filled with the sorrow that would later define her. Her eyes are filled with pure, unadulterated, athletic joy. She is smiling. She is sweating. She is in absolute control of the beat. That is how she deserved to be remembered, not as a fragile, broken doll manipulated by the industry, but as a brilliant, vibrant musician who just wanted to play the drums and be loved for her own rhythm. The stage has been empty for 43 years. The bright, blinding lights of the 1970s have completely faded into the dark. The drum kit has been packed away. But as the needle drops on the vinyl and that impossibly rich, warm, mahogany voice floats into the room once again, the girl from Connecticut achieves her ultimate, undeniable victory. The executives, the controlling managers, and the fierce matriarchs are all gone. But Karen remains. She is still comforting the brokenhearted. She is still singing in the rain. And her beautiful, gentle soul will completely, absolutely outlast us all. As we say goodbye to the angelic, heartbreaking, and profoundly beautiful story of Karen Carpenter, the camera turns away from the Hollywood stage, and it focuses gently, deeply on you. Karen's tragic journey is a devastating reminder of the heavy, sometimes fatal price we pay when we sacrifice our true selves to meet the impossible, suffocating expectations of others. She taught us that the illusion of a perfect family is never worth the cost of a human soul. What about you? Have you ever felt trapped by the crushing expectations of your own family? Have you ever had to silence your own voice just to keep the peace in your home? How did you finally find the courage to break free and reclaim your own rhythm? Please, take a moment to share your stories of healing, your struggles with family expectations, and your hard-earned wisdom in the comments below. Your story of finding your own voice might be exactly the beacon of light someone else needs to see today. If this tribute to Karen Carpenter's enduring, gentle spirit moved you, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more deep, unfiltered stories behind the legends we love. Thank you for your time. Remember that you are enough exactly as you are. Protect your own voice, and until next time, keep moving forward.